My name is Alistair Finch, and my professional life, if one could call it that, has largely been defined by quietude and the peculiar scent of places recently, and often hastily, vacated. I am, for lack of a more elegant term, a high-end caretaker, specializing in properties that require a discreet, long-term presence, often under circumstances their owners prefer not to dwell upon. It's a solitary existence, one that has honed my senses and, I suppose, dulled my capacity for surprise. Or so I believed. I've occupied sprawling, silent manors haunted only by dust and memory, and modern architectural marvels, whose only flaw was an owner too embroiled in scandal to enjoy them. Each assignment was a study in stillness, a vigil over the material remnants of lives interrupted. I was, in essence, a professional ghost, unseen, unheard, ensuring that the properties remained inviolate until their owners, or fate, decided their next chapter. The summons for the Montana assignment arrived via a third-party legal firm, as these things often do, a crisp, cream-colored envelope containing a contract sparse on details but excessively generous in compensation. The client, as expected, was anonymous, referred to only as the benefactor. The property was an estate named Blackwood Ridge, nestled deep within a sparsely populated region of Montana. My duties were vaguely defined: to maintain a presence, ensure the security of the main house and immediate grounds, and report any significant structural or environmental issues. The duration was 6 months, possibly longer. No mention was made of previous caretakers, nor any particular issues, beyond the inherent challenges of a remote location. The sum offered was enough to make me overlook the lack of transparency, a common enough trade, often my line of work. Perhaps there was a lingering legal dispute, a family squabble, or simply an owner who desired absolute privacy. My job wasn't to ask why, only to occupy. The journey to Blackwood Ridge was a descent into profound isolation. I flew into Missoula, then rented a sturdy 4F4. The drive began pleasantly enough, through rolling hills and picturesque valleys. But with each passing hour, civilization thinned. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to deeply rutted dirt tracks that clawed their way through dense, towering forests of pine and fir. The last town, a place called Sparrow Creek, was little more than a cluster of weathered buildings huddled around a gas station and a general store. The air there already felt different, heavier, scented with damp earth and the perpetual twilight of the deep woods. I stopped for gas and supplies. The attendant, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh winters, eyed my vehicle, and then me with a couldn't quite decipher, not hostile, but guarded. Headed far up? He asked, his voice raspy. Blackwood Ridge, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the mountains that loomed like dark sentinels in the distance. That's a ways out. Not much company up there. Used to be a ranger station way back, and some old logging camps. Quiet now. Too quiet, some say. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Cryptic warnings from locals were practically a trope in these situations, usually amounting to nothing more than superstition or a desire to spook the outsider. Still, his words, "Too quiet," echoed in my mind as I drove on. The final stretch of the track was barely a suggestion of a road, the trees pressing in so close their branches scraped against the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers. Blackwood Ridge emerged from the gloom of the forest, not with a whisper but with a brooding sigh. The main house was a sprawling, two-story structure of dark timber, and to its architecture a peculiar blend of rustic hunting lodge and Victorian Gothic. It possessed a kind of faded grandeur, but decay was visibly setting in, paint peeling from the window frames, a slight sag in one section of the porch roof, and an air of profound neglect despite its structural integrity. Several outbuildings, a stables, a workshop, what looked like a small, self-contained cottage stood further back, slowly being reclaimed by the encroaching wilderness. The keys were not handed over by a departing representative. Instead, as per my emailed instructions, I found them in a magnetic lockbox, attached to the underside of a rusted weather vane atop a crumbling stone gatepost. The silence was the first thing that struck me. Not a peaceful, pastoral silence, but a thick, watchful stillness that seemed to absorb sound. The air was cold even for late autumn, and carried the scent of pine needles and damp stone. As I stepped onto the porch, the heavy oak door creaking open before me, I had the distinct and unsettling sensation of being observed not by eyes, but by the house itself, by the very trees that ringed the clearing. Inside, dust lay thick on everything, undisturbed for what looked like months, if not longer. Furniture, heavy and dark, was draped in white sheets, resembling a congregation of shrouded figures. The layout was labyrinthine, a confusing warren of rooms and corridors, many of which seemed to serve no discernible purpose. In the kitchen, a calendar on the wall was still turned to July of the previous year. Oddly, several interior doors, particularly those leading to a narrow hallway on the ground floor, were fitted with heavy deadbolts, some of which looked recently installed. More unnerving still, in what appeared to be a nursery on the second floor, the windows were boarded up not from the outside, but from within, the planks nailed crudely across the glass. Signs of a hasty, perhaps fearful, departure. I spent the first day methodically going about my routine, unpacking essential supplies, checking the generator, the water pump, and the satellite internet connection, surprisingly functional. Though sluggish, I walked the perimeter of the main house and the immediate outbuildings, noting areas that would require attention. I tried to impose a sense of order, of normalcy, onto the oppressive atmosphere. Internally, I cataloged the estate's quirks, the unsettling stillness, the strange interior locks, as products of isolation, and perhaps the eccentricities of a previous occupant. Loneliness was a familiar companion in my work, and the initial grandeur of Blackwood Ridge, despite its decay, held a certain melancholic appeal. I told myself the feeling of being watched was simply my imagination adjusting to the profound solitude. The first night, however, the house began to breathe around me. I was in the large, vaulted living room, reading by the light of a propane lamp. The generator switched off to conserve fuel. Old houses settle, I know this. Timbers contract, floorboards creak. But these sounds were different. A distinct, rhythmic tapping seemed to emanate from within the walls of the western wing, a section of the house I had yet to fully explore. It would stop if I made a noise, then resume once silence returned. Later, as I lay in the master bedroom, a vast, cold chamber, I heard what sounded like a floorboard creaking in the hallway outside my door. I called out, but there was no reply. Only the oppressive silence rushing back in. I dismissed it as the house, the wind, my own tired mind. The next day, while poring over some old schematics of the estate, I found in a desk drawer, more out of a need to understand the sprawling layout than anything else, I noticed a faded, hand-drawn addition to the official survey map. Deep within the property lines, several miles from the main house, a small area was circled and labeled in faint pencil, "Old campsite, disused." The park ranger comment from the gas station attendant came back to me. Perhaps it was one of those old logging camps he'd mentioned. I felt a faint prickle of curiosity, quickly suppressed. My duties were confined to the main house and its immediate vicinity. That evening, the unsettling occurrences became less ambiguous. I had meticulously organized my small collection of reference books on a shelf in the study. When I returned after a brief walk outside to check the generator before nightfall, one book, a field guide to alpine flora, was lying open on the floor, its pages riffled as if by a sudden gust of wind. Though all windows were closed, I was certain I hadn't touched it. Later, a fleeting shadow danced in my peripheral vision as I passed the darkened doorway of the dining room. When I turned, there was nothing, just the sheet, draped table, and the cold, empty space. A sudden cold spot enveloped me in the hallway, near the bolted nursery door, so intense it raised gooseflesh on my arms, then vanished as quickly as it came. The feeling of being watched intensified, no longer a vague sensation, but a palpable pressure, as if unseen eyes were fixed on my every move, even through the solid walls. The third night brought the escalation I had subconsciously been dreading. I woke with a start, unsure what had disturbed me. The silence in the room was absolute, yet charged with an undeniable tension. Then I heard it, a sound that could not be rationalized away as the house settling or the wind playing tricks. It was a whisper, faint but distinct, seeming to come from the hallway just beyond my bedroom door. It wasn't words I could understand, more a sibilant, breathy murmur, like someone speaking in hushed, urgent tones. My heart hammered against my ribs. I strained my ears, every nerve ending screaming. The whispering stopped, replaced by a soft, deliberate scraping sound, like fingernails being drawn slowly across wood. Slowly, cautiously, I rose from the bed. My hand reaching for the heavy flashlight I kept on the nightstand. My professionalism, my carefully constructed composure, was beginning to crack. This wasn't the creak of an old house. This felt intentional. I moved towards the door, my breath held tight in my chest. The scraping stopped. I waited, listening. Silence. Then, from downstairs, came a single, resonant thud, like something heavy being dropped, or a door slamming shut with immense force. I spent the rest of that night with my back against the headboard. Flashlight beam, cutting swaths through the oppressive darkness of the room, every shadow seeming to writhe with unseen movement. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced, trying to piece together logical explanations that felt increasingly flimsy. Animals, unlikely to be so deliberate, so personal. A squatter. The remoteness made it improbable, and there were no signs of forced entry beyond what I'd initially observed. The following morning, bleary-eyed and on edge, I found all the interior doors, along the ground floor, hallway, the ones with the heavy deadbolts, standing wide open. I had checked each one before retiring, ensuring they were closed, though I hadn't bothered with the bolts. Now, they gaped like empty mouths. My own travel mug, which I distinctly remembered leaving on the kitchen counter, sat on the dusty, moth-eaten seat of a child's rocking chair in the boarded-up nursery, a room I had only glanced into on my first day and had no intention of revisiting. A cold dread, far deeper than simple unease, began to seep into my bones. I started documenting everything in a small notebook: the sounds, the moved objects, the times. I checked all exterior locks, wedged chairs under doorknobs. These were the actions of a man losing control, not a seasoned caretaker. My professional detachment was shattering, replaced by a primal, growing fear. The true turning point, the moment the title of this unfolding nightmare seared itself into my consciousness, came that afternoon, driven by a desperate need to understand, or perhaps to find something, anything, that could explain the escalating strangeness. I decided to investigate the source of the tapping sounds from the first night. The western wing. It was a part of the house. I'd avoided a maze of smaller, dustier rooms that felt even older and more neglected than the rest. In what might have once been a servant's quarters tucked away at the very end of a narrow, lightless corridor, I found it. Not a source of tapping, but something far more chilling. Scratched into the grimy surface of a window pane, almost invisible until the light caught it just so, was a single, frantically etched word, "Leston," and beneath it, almost too faint to see, a crude drawing of a stick figure, running from something outside the frame of the small, dirty pane. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't my imagination. This was a warning, left by someone who had been here before me, someone who had clearly experienced something that terrified them. I backed away from the window, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. The silence of the house pressed in, no longer just watchful, but actively malevolent. I finally understood. I wasn't just watching over an estate. I was trapped inside something else entirely. Something was terribly wrong at Blackwood Ridge, and I had a horrifying suspicion that its attention was now turning fully towards me. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes like skeletal applause, and for the first time in my solitary career, I felt utterly, hopelessly alone, and profoundly afraid. The breath hitched in my throat, a raw, painful gasp. "Leston." The word was a command, a plea, a threat, all gouged into the filthy glass of the sunroom window. Beside it, a stick figure, crude and childlike, was frozen mid-sprint, arms flailing, legs pumping in a silent scream of escape. The image, combined with the single, stark word, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, colder and sharper than the Montana air that seeped persistently through the lodge's ancient window seals. My fingers, trembling slightly, reached out to touch the etching. It was surprisingly deep, not merely scratched but carved into the pane. The edges felt rough, almost jagged against my skin. It didn't feel ancient, not like something left decades ago to be discovered by chance. There was a rawness to it, a sense of immediacy. The dust around the carving was disturbed, yes, but not in a way that suggested it had just been made. It was more as if the dust had settled around the disturbance, accommodating it. The person who did this, they must have used something hard, something sharp, a rock, maybe a piece of metal. The force required? The sheer desperation implied by the crude lines painted a horrifying picture of their state of mind. This wasn't a casual piece of vandalism. It was a testament, a frantic warning. I leaned closer, scrutinizing the running figure. It was angled away from the interior of the sunroom, as if fleeing out of the estate, or perhaps deeper into the oppressive woods that ringed the property. The posture was one of pure, unadulterated panic. Every line screamed terror. My mind, trained to seek logical explanations, scrambled for purchase. A prank. Local kids, perhaps, managing to bypass the locked gate and the miles of rough track. Highly unlikely. The remoteness of the Blackwood estate was its defining feature. A disgruntled former employee of Mr. Blackwood, leaving a cryptic message. More plausible, perhaps. But the visceral fear conveyed by that simple drawing felt far more primal than mere workplace dissatisfaction. Or was it exactly what it appeared to be, a warning left by someone who had experienced something here? Something that made them want to tell anyone who followed to listen and to run. I moved quickly, checking the other windows in the sunroom, then those in the adjoining library and drawing room. Nothing. No other marks. No other messages. Just this one window, this one chilling tableau. Why here? What was visible from this specific vantage point that had prompted such a desperate act? I peered out through the etched glass. The window offered a wide, unsettling panorama of the overgrown back lawn, which sloped down towards the dense, dark, and utterly silent tree line. The trees themselves seemed to press in, a wall of ancient sentinels. Whatever the previous occupant had seen or heard, it was likely out there, in that unnerving expanse. Or perhaps something from out there had been trying to get in, right through this very pane of glass. The window, a fragile barrier, had become a focal point of past terror, and now, a beacon of potential future threat for me. The word, Easton, seemed to throb in the dusty air, echoing in the sudden silence of my own thoughts. Compelled, almost against my better judgment, against the rising tide of instinct that screamed at me to get in the truck and drive, until Montana was a distant memory, I consciously tried to obey. I strained my ears, actively filtering out the low moan of the wind as it curled around the eaves of the old lodge, a sound that had, until moments ago, been a comforting backdrop of isolation. At first, there was only the familiar symphony of an old, empty house, the subtle creak and groan of settling timbers, the distant, dry rustle of unseen leaves skittering across a porch roof. But then, a shift. A profound change in the auditory landscape. The absence of sound became the most noticeable thing. The normal chorus of the forest, the chirping of birds, the busy chattering of squirrels, the drone of insect sounds I'd taken for granted, even in this remote location, seemed unnaturally muted, almost entirely gone. An oppressive, heavy silence blanketed the estate, a silence that felt profoundly wrong, like a held breath. It wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. It felt as if the very woods were holding their breath, cowed by something far more significant than my lone presence. I began to move through the cavernous lodge, my boots thudding unnaturally loudly on the polished wood floors. From the grand hall to the dusty dining room, then into the shadowy kitchen, the silence followed me, a palpable entity in itself. It was broken only by my own sounds, my footsteps, the catch of my breath, each one jarringly loud, an unwelcome intrusion into the unnatural stillness. Then I heard it, so faint, so subtle, I almost dismissed it as imagination, a product of my heightened senses, a rhythmic, soft thump, or was it more of a drag? The ambiguity of the sound made it all the more unsettling. It seemed to emanate from the direction of the main staircase, or perhaps the floor above, the vast, unexplored territory of the second story. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy, swallowed instantly by the heavy quiet. There was no echo, no response. And then, the thumping or dragging stopped. Just like that. The silence rushed back in, now heavier, more watchful, as if whatever had made the sound was now aware of me, listening in turn. The fact that it reacted, that it stopped because of my call, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. It implied sentience, a consciousness that was now alerted to my awareness of it. I fumbled for the satellite phone Mr. Blackwood had insisted I carry. No signal, the screen declared, as it had since I'd passed through the main gates. The two-way radio he'd also provided, a heavy-duty piece of kit, crackled with an impenetrable wall of static, no matter which channel I selected. The isolation, which had initially felt like a peaceful perk of the job, now felt absolute, a tightening noose. A chilling curiosity, a morbid fascination intertwined with a primal urge to flee, began to war within me. The memory of that faint, responsive sound from upstairs gnawed at me. Despite every instinct screaming at me, to barricade myself in a room, or better yet, make a run for the truck, I found myself drawn towards the grand staircase. I detoured to the massive stone fireplace in the main hall and grabbed the heavy iron poker. It was a meager weapon against the unknown, but its solid weight in my hand was a small comfort. As I ascended the creaking, ornate staircase, each step groaning under my weight, a distinct cold spot enveloped me on the first landing. It was a pocket of unnatural chill, so intense that my breath misted in the air before me. The temperature plummeted several degrees in the space of a few steps, the air growing clammy and still, then returned to the ambient cool of the old house as I moved past it. There was no draft, no open window to explain it. It was just there. A localized anomaly of cold. The upstairs hallway was long and shadowed, lined with closed doors, each one a potential Pandora's box. I chose one at random, my hand hesitating on the cold brass knob before turning it. A bedroom. Opulent even in its decay, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in faded, once rich fabrics. Everything was coated in a thick, uniform layer of dust, the kind that speaks of years, decades even, of undisturbed neglect. Yet, in the very center of the dusty coverlet on the bed, there was a single, fresh indentation. It wasn't deep, more like a shallow depression, as if someone or something had been sitting there very recently. The outline was clear in the otherwise smooth expanse of dust. It was undeniably there, a stark contradiction to the ancient stillness of the room. A faint, musky, and slightly sweet odor permeated the air in this room, different from the general dry mustiness of the rest of the lodge. It was cloying and deeply unpleasant, making the hairs on the back of my neck prick out. I backed out, pulling the door shut, and moved to the next. A study. Here, the scene was one of disarray. Books were pulled haphazardly from the towering shelves, some lying open on the floor, their pages splayed as if hastily searched or scattered in a fit of rage or panic. Papers were strewn across a large mahogany desk and the surrounding carpet. This disturbance felt more recent, more violent, than the quiet indentation in the bedroom. One leather-bound volume lay conspicuously open on the floor, almost as if placed there. It was a book on local Montana folklore, and a particular passage was crudely circled with something dark and dried. It looked like mud, or perhaps, chillingly, old blood. My heart hammered as I read the circled words. Beware the things that listen from the trees, the spirits of the deep woods that hunger. They are the shadows that mimic, the whispers on the wind. The words resonated with a sickening clarity, connecting directly to the command on the window. Eyster. And the running figure fleeing these very things. The temporal dissonance of the lodge was unnerving. Decades of undisturbed dust coexisting with these signs of very recent, very disturbing activity. It was as if the past and present were bleeding into one another, or that something ancient had been reawakened. An active, ongoing presence. Were these clues? The cold spot, the indentation, the specific odor. This circled passage, were they incidental by-products of whatever haunted this place, or were they something more deliberate? A warning, a taunt, a trail of breadcrumbs leading me deeper into the nightmare. As I stared at the circled passage, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed a door shut, further down the hallway. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence, making me jump, the poker clattering against the floorboards as I fumbled it. The wind outside began to howl, rising in pitch and intensity, no longer a mournful moan, but an angry shriek. And carried on that wind, I heard it, whispering, I strained to listen, the command from the window, a fresh imperative. This time, it wasn't a subtle thump or a dragging sound. Mixed with the keening of the wind, distinct and undeniable, were whispers. Indistinct at first, sibilant and insidious, like the rustling of dry snakeskin, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, just at the very edge of my auditory perception. I stumbled to the nearest hallway window, peering out into the rapidly darkening afternoon. The sky was a bruised purple, gray. The trees at the edge of the property, the ones that formed that impenetrable wall, were swaying violently, their movements too erratic, too aggressive for the wind alone to account for. And then, for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, in the deepest shadows between two ancient, gnarled pines, I thought I saw movement. Something tall, unnaturally thin. A silhouette darker than the surrounding gloom that was there. And then it was gone, vanishing as quickly as I'd perceived it. I blinked, shaking my head, telling myself it was a trick of the light, the play of shadows and swaying branches, but the image was seared into my mind. The whispering intensified, growing louder, closer. It seemed to coalesce, the sibilant sounds now forming fragmented, broken words. I couldn't make them out clearly, not quite, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking, filled with a chilling, predatory hunger. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was no longer subtle. The rational part of my brain, the part that had tried to find logical explanations for the etching, the silence, the indentation, was screaming, overwhelmed. The park ranger in me, the man trained with tangible dangers, wildfires, lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, was utterly adrift, useless against this intangible, insidious, and rapidly escalating threat. The phenomena were no longer ambiguous. They were a direct sensory assault. The very environment, the wind, the trees, seemed to be an extension of this malevolent presence, conduits for its voice and its fleeting, terrifying manifestations. The whispers seemed to be calling my name now, or a distorted, corrupted version of it. Alistair. A drawn-out, sibilant hiss that slithered into my ears. The sound seemed to be drawing me, pulling me towards a specific part of the lodge. My eyes were drawn to a dark, previously unnoticed, narrow doorway at the far end of the upstairs hall. A space I hadn't registered before, cloaked in deep shadow. Or perhaps it was beckoning me towards the cellar, the thought of which sent a fresh wave of revulsion through me. An unnatural compulsion began to take root, a morbid curiosity hideously intertwined with sheer, gut-wrenching terror. I wanted to run, to scream, to barricade myself and wait for dawn. But an insidious part of me felt compelled to follow the sound, to see what awaited, to understand the source of this all-consuming dread. Ice 10. Command on the window had been an instruction. These whispers were a summons. Poker held high, its iron tip cold against my sweating palm. I took a single, hesitant step towards that shadowed doorway, towards the intensified whispering. The air around me grew colder still. The musky, sweet odor I'd noticed in the bedroom, now faintly present here, too stronger, more cloying. I stood at the threshold of this new, unknown area, the whispers swirling around me, a vortex of sibilant promises and unspoken threats. They promised something: knowledge, annihilation. They seemed to wreathe in the air, almost visible. I was faced with an impossible choice: retreat into the deceptive safety of the rooms behind me, a futile act given the pervasive nature of this haunting. Attempt to flee the estate, out into those listening woods where the tall, thin figure lurked. Or step forward, into the beckoning dark, to confront the source of the terror that had so utterly consumed the Blackwood estate. The whispers intensified, urging me on. The whispers had led me here to this door. It was a dark stain in the dim hallway, a feature I could have sworn hadn't been there moments before. They weren't just sounds anymore, those insidious murmurings. They were a current, pulling me forward, promising something. Answers. Relief from the gnawing dread that had become my constant companion in this godforsaken Montana estate. I didn't know, but the pull was undeniable. My hand, sweat with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house, trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was old brass, and felt colder than any metal had a right to be, leaching warmth from my fingertips. A war raged in my head, one part the rational Alistair, the one who still clung to sanity by a thread, screamed at me to turn, to run, to get out of this house and never look back. "Flee!" it shrieked. This is how people die in stories. But another part, a darker, more insidious voice amplified by the chorus of whispers that now seemed to coil around me, like invisible serpents, was captivated. A perverse curiosity, a desperate need to understand the wrongness that permeated this place, had taken root. The whispers were seductive now, a siren song promising to unveil the mystery, to show me what lay at the heart of the terror. The air around the door was frigid, a stark contrast to the rest of the hallway. I ran my other hand over the wood. It felt wrong. Too smooth, like polished bone, yet with an underlying dampness that made my skin crawl. The whispers intensified. No longer just heard but felt. A low thrumming vibration in my chest, a building pressure behind my eyes. The oppressive silence of the rest of the sprawling mansion seemed to magnify them, making them the only tangible thing in my crumbling reality. I couldn't fight it. The compulsion was an iron band around my will, squeezing out every last drop of resistance. With a shuddering breath that felt like my last, I turned the knob. The click of the latch was obscenely loud in the silence, followed by a low, groaning creak as the door swung inward. The sound echoed, not just in the hallway, but somewhere deeper, resonating with an unnatural timbre that vibrated through the very foundations of the house and into my soul. This wasn't just opening a door. It was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. What greeted me wasn't a room I recognized from Mr. Blackwood's hurried tour. My flashlight beam, already struggling against the encroaching gloom of the estate, seemed to be swallowed whole by what lay beyond. It was a corridor, impossibly narrow and stretching into a darkness, so profound it felt like a physical entity. The geometry of it was wrong. subtly skewed in a way that made my head spin and my stomach churn. It didn't belong here. It couldn't possibly fit within the known architecture of the house. A foul odor assaulted my nostrils, a cloying mix of damp earth, something metallic like old blood, and an underlying scent of decay that was both ancient and sickeningly fresh. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a hidden passage. It was an aberration, a cancerous growth within the house itself. The whispers surged, louder now. No longer seductive, but filled with a cacophony of sibilant, eager voices. Mixed with them were new sounds, subtle at first, then growing more distinct, a faint, dry skittering, like insects with too many legs, and a wet, dragging noise that suggested something heavy and limp being pulled across a rough surface. A low, almost sub-audible hum vibrated through the floorboards, resonating in my teeth. The walls, if you could call them that, weren't wood or plaster. In the weak, flickering reach of my flashlight, they seemed to be made of something else. Dark, glistening, with a texture that looked disturbingly organic, as if I had stepped into the gullet of some colossal, unseen beast. The air was thick, heavy, and cold, a dead, stagnant cold that had nothing to do with a Montana winter. This place felt ancient, far older than the house, older than the mountains themselves. It was a wound in the world, and I had just stumbled into its festering depths. I wanted to turn, to slam the door shut and barricade it. But even as the thought formed, a chilling certainty settled over me. There was no going back. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The doorway, it wasn't there. Or perhaps it was, but it had blended seamlessly into the shifting, organic-looking wall, leaving no trace of its existence. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the dread. The whispers seemed to mock my terror, now actively pushing me forward, not with a physical touch, but with an undeniable psychic pressure that made my temples throb. I was trapped. My feet moved, clumsy and reluctant, carrying me deeper into the impossible corridor. As I stumbled onward, the weak beam of my flashlight picked out more details, each more horrifying than the last. The walls were covered in crude, spidery drawings, symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse with a faint, internal luminescence in the periphery of my vision. They depicted forms that defied earthly biology, shapes that twisted the eye and mind. In alcoves that appeared and disappeared, with the shifting geometry of the passage, I saw piles of bones, small, delicate things. Not human, thank God, but arranged in bizarre, ritualistic patterns that spoke of a terrible, alien intellect. The skittering and dragging sounds grew closer. I could hear them behind me, then to the sides, as if whatever made them was flanking me, hurting me. A primal fear, the kind that bypasses thought and goes straight for the spine, told me I was being watched by countless unseen eyes, studied by something ancient and malevolent. The whispers began to coalesce, the sibilant chorus resolving into distinct, chilling phrases. They weren't in English, not quite, but the meaning bled through. Raw and terrifying fragments of a history, steeped in blood and madness, promises of agonizing revelation, declarations of an insatiable, eternal hunger. This was it. This was the triblywrog I had felt setting foot on this cursed estate. It wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It was something far older, far more fundamental, a presence, an entity, a force that had claimed this land, this house, and was now reaching out for me. The air grew heavier, the silence between the whispers more profound, more laden with unspoken threat. The corridor finally opened into a space. I hesitate to call it a chamber. It was vast, far larger than any room in the house could possibly be. The oppressive darkness was thicker here, almost liquid, and my flashlight beam was a pathetic, dying ember against it. In the center, or what I perceived as the center in the disorienting, non-Euclidean space, there was something. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood, not as I understood it. It was a vortex of shifting shadows, a churning mass of impossible angles and broken light, a place where the fabric of reality itself seemed to have been torn open and was bleeding into our world. It pulsed with a lightless energy, and the whispers emanated from it, a deafening torrent of alien thought and raw, unadulterated malice. I couldn't scream. The sound died in my throat, a strangled gasp. My muscles locked, my mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the sheer, mind-breaking alienness of what I was witnessing. This was the source, the heart of the wrongness. It felt me, I knew it did. A wave of nauseating cold washed over me, accompanied by a barrage of horrific images that flashed through my mind, aeons of cosmic dread. Civilizations crumbling into dust, stars dying, the universe itself screaming in silent agony. It wasn't just seeing it, it was knowing it, a truth so vast and terrible it threatened to shatter my sanity into a million pieces. The shadows wreathed, coalescing, reaching. I felt a pull, not physical, but essential, as if my very soul was being drawn towards that churning abyss. It wanted to consume me, to absorb me, to make me part of its ancient, terrible existence. I squeezed my eyes shut, a futile gesture against a horror that was already seared onto my brain. I think I might have babbled then, prayed to any god that might be listening, though I knew, with a chilling certainty, that no benevolent deity held sway in this place. Then something shifted, a sound, a tearing, ripping noise, not from the entity, but from somewhere else, somewhere within the house itself. Or was it within me? I don't know. There was a sudden, violent pressure, an expulsion. One moment I was on the precipice of annihilation. The next I was tumbling, falling. The oppressive darkness receding, replaced by dim, familiar light. I landed hard on a wooden floor, the air knocked from my lungs. I lay there gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. I was in the main hallway of the Blackwood estate, near the grand staircase. The dark door was gone. The corridor, the chamber, the entity, all vanished as if they had never been. Sunlight, weak and pale, filtered through the dusty windows. How did I get here? I had no memory of escaping, no recollection of the journey back from that abyss. One moment I was facing oblivion, the next I was here. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady. I didn't stop to think, to question. I burst out of the front door, into the cold Montana air, and didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until the accursed estate was miles behind me. I never returned. I never collected my final paycheck. I left Montana and never spoke of what happened in that house, not to a living soul. Not until now. But it's not over. Not really. The estate might be behind me, but the experience, it changed me. I bear scars no doctor can see. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear them. Faint. So faint I almost convince myself it's the wind, or the ringing in my ears. The whispers. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, in the deep shadows of my own eyes, I see a flicker of that impossible geometry, a hint of the vast, cold darkness I witnessed. It's a terrifying thought, one that keeps me awake more nights than I can count. Maybe I didn't entirely escape. Maybe a part of that wrongness, a tiny, insidious seed, came back with me.